Okay, let's get on to questions. So there's a few that have come in, so I'll just kick off with the last one. In a corporate or highly political environment, it can be very difficult to have conversations around integrity, given there are often vastly different motivations between execs and very little common moral ground. How do you tackle that?
Wow. Okay, look, this is a really, really good question. So we have two problems. So I'll be upfront with one of them. Certainly if you're in the Western world, without a shadow of doubt, historically, the Judeo-Christian ethic has shaped almost all of our ethical thinking at levels far more deeply and profound than we're ever prepared to admit to ourselves. I was speaking at every year in the UK we have a prayer breakfast, and I was speaking at it this year, and the guy who was doing like the main thing was a guy some of you in this room may know of called Tim Keller. You're not familiar with him. He's like a young upcoming guy in North America. I feel there's a lot of promise if he keeps working hard. And he started off, for example, he said, let me tell a story about a professor of history at one of America's leading universities, and every year he gets all the students together, several hundred of the students, and he says, I'm going to ask you a question. He says, because he says, you've been influenced by Judeo-Christian thinking more than you think. He says, here's the scenario. I want you to imagine that you're walking down a street and you see an old lady walking towards you with a bag stuffed with jewels. And there are three things you need to know. Number one, that theft in this country is not illegal. So there's no legal ramification. Number two, there's no way that they're going to recognize you. And number three, there's no one who's going to stop you. He says, would you attack her and take these jewels from her? If the answer is no, why wouldn't you do it? Would you not do it because you would think that makes me look bad? It shows me as a weak person. For me, as someone who's in a position of strength and power, to use my strength and power against someone who is weak and defenseless, that's bad for me. It looks bad for me, and it will make me a weak person, and I couldn't possibly do that. Is that why you wouldn't take her jewels? Is it B, you think, no, that's the wrong way to treat her. Okay, I should treat her and value her in the same way I would anybody else, and therefore I should treat her in a way that is respectful with that, and that's what I need to do, and that's why I wouldn't steal it? Or is it C, some other reason? And every single student, every single year will put up their hand and say the answer's B. Well, here's the thing. Before the advent of Christianity in the Roman Empire, everybody would have chosen A, 100%. It's an honor culture. You have to conduct yourself with power and honor. To do such a dishonorable thing is bad for you. It makes you look good. It makes you look bad. It makes you look weak. It makes you into a worse person, so you don't do it. That would be your ethical thinking. The fact that virtually everybody in any Western world will choose B, where the ethic and the regard is for the other, well, that self-regarding ethic for the other and loving the other person as you would love yourself. I mean, this is what was so revolutionary about what Jesus Christ brought through his teaching, and then how it then became ethicalized within the Roman Empire. Now, we live with the consequence of that, regardless of what we believe in the West. So what's happened is that we've inherited a system of ethics, and we're no longer connected to its source or its root. So then we can't sustain where it comes from. Now, the problem in the corporate setting was very beautifully illustrated for me when I was speaking in the City of London not long ago. And their global head of compliance happened to be passing through the country for this particular firm and said, do you mind if I sit in? And I said, sure, sit in the back. And when it came to the Q&A, he put up his hand, and this financial firm has well over 100,000 employees around the world. And he says, okay, in our company, he says, we talk about client-driven ethics. Does that help us? And I said, no. I said, because if your client is a pedophile, and you want to take your values from them, you're going to say, well, the following schools have low security, and here's how you can get in, and this is the best way to go about it, and here's how you can transfer money around to make sure you don't get caught. And that's what you'll do. And the guy literally, he threw his hands in the air. He said, exactly. He said, that's our problem. He says, it's absolutely meaningless. So I spoke with the guy afterwards, and he said, Michael, he says, we videoed your talk today, and I didn't realize they'd done that. And I said, oh, okay. He says, do you mind if we send it to all 147,000 employees we have? And so I asked him, because I had it came out that, obviously I was coming at this from a Christian perspective. He wasn't a Christian. And I said, are you sure you're happy to email this around with all of the references to the Christian faith that I brought in, the Bible, and various other things I said? He said yes. He said, we spent a couple of $1 million so far flying in people around the world to talk to this kind of stuff. He said, this is the only one I've enjoyed listening to so far. So we're going to have to actually then come to that next point, which is that we have to figure out what the root and the basis of our ethics actually is. So the trouble is, and you can't get it from just anywhere. If you want to read a very controversial book on this, there is a brilliant atheist by the name of Professor John Gray. Now, there are two famous Professor Grays out there. One wrote a book called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. That's a different John Gray, okay? Right? He's famous for other reasons. Okay? The Gray I'm talking about is the history of European political thought at the London School for Economics. And he wrote a book called Straw Dogs. Now, I find him a fascinating atheist because I almost agree with him 100% with everything he says, so long as I grant him his premise that there is no God. Now, if he's wrong about that, everything else he says is wrong. But here's what he says. And this is the guy who, for almost 2 decades held arguably one of the most prestigious chairs in political thought in the world. He said, look, he says, we have a philosophy of politics which is fundamentally incompatible with our secular worldview. He says Christians can be forgiven in believing in human rights, human purpose, because they believe in the myth that man was created in the image of God. He said this gives men and women some kind of inherent worth. He says, but we don't believe in that myth. He says, we believe that's a myth. He says, we believe we're simply here through random chance and the survival of the fittest. He says, you can't get an ethic that you should care for the poor, the widow, the blind, the weak, and so on, from survival of the fittest. Those are the people who get selected out. He says, we are currently holding ourselves back from taking the dominant position in the world we have because we've inherited this myth from these Christians. He says, and we have to get rid of it. So he's very famous for saying that he's an atheist who hates humanism because he says humanism is just Christian morality expressed in secular words. He says, but it's not compatible with secularism itself. We have to embrace an ethic of survival of the fittest, and we have to completely change our political, economic, and social landscape to live that out. And that's why he sold tens of millions of books, and his books have been translated, most of them, into almost 100 plus languages. So, this isn't a guy in a little corner somewhere, but he's got the same issue. Does that make sense? Now, what I have to say I did find funny is I got invited to hear Professor Gray speak at the House of Lords in England just after the financial crisis. And I went because I thought, I'm so interested to hear this guy. In a sense, this whole thing about our ethics are fundamentally incompatible and we need to get rid of Christianity and the Christian myths and all this kind of throw that out and we only should have survival of the fittest. I thought, what will he say about the financial crisis? And 3 other people spoke and it came to him and they said, Professor Gray, what do you think? And he stood up and he said, this is utterly outrageous, it's immoral, it's unethical, I can't believe all these corrupt bankers have just stolen all my money and made my pension fund worth nothing. And he went on this long moral, and it was when the politeness side up, so that I'm half Middle Eastern, half English. So there's part of me that sort of doesn't care what I say to anyone, and there's another part of me that thinks, if I'm really angry, what you say is, oh. And so, so I'm there, and I was there was a member of the House of the Lords who brought me along to this particular debate, and he said, don't you want to ask a question? And because I so wanted to say, Professor Gray, I think I've read almost everything you've written, and it's fascinating. Can I just quote you back at you, and then ask you where this sense of moral outrage comes from, because you've spent most of your life arguing there's no such thing as morality or ethics. So, but it was interesting, wasn't it? When it suddenly impinged on him, all of a sudden his view was so different. And so, but I think we need to find within the corporate space the ability to be able to talk about that. We need something. Either there has to be some kind of understanding of ethics and moralities that springs from some form of dignity and worth of the human life, an individual, or we do embrace the idea that we're simply... So his book is called Straw Dogs, because what Professor Gray says is, look, we're just dogs. Make sense? That's it. Just look at how wild dogs treat each other. That's the ethics that we have. That's what we need to politically legislate in our country. And so the reason I like someone like Gray is I think we can have a really honest debate. Does that make sense? That we can really go at each other. It's a very, very, very hard thing. Historically, we had some better disagreements about this kind of thing. The 2 very famous French philosophers fell out with each other over this issue, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. when they were talking about an ethical injustice they saw in North Africa, with one saying, but maybe we should adopt this particular moral position, and the other one saying no, because there's no such thing. And there's such a sharp disagreement, they cease to be friends. But at least there was this recognition of, I mean, since we have a problem here, let's try and figure it out. At the moment, we're just assuming kinds of things, and we're not necessarily thinking about them very clearly.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Well, we do have 10 questions here,
Okay.
but I'm just trying to distill it for me. So I'm thinking with that person that's asked that question, try and dig a bit deeper with the friends around you to try and work out what is your ethic here, what are you working from to get out?
Well, I'll tell you what, and I know you're involved a bit with this. I have a friend in the City of London called Richard Broman. And for the last little while, he's been meeting with some senior executives, including some CEOs of the FTSE 100 companies. And he basically says to them, look, you've got all these questions you're asking right now, and they say yes. And then he draws a little diagram, and he says, look, there are 4 basic ways where you can get your ethics from. He says, and I think you're coming from this square over here. And they all say yes. He says, well, that square assumes the truth of the Judeo-Christian faith. And they normally go, oh. And then he says, well, what do you know about it? And there comes a time when you're senior enough where you can just be honest, and they go, nothing. And he goes, well, are you happy being that ignorant about something you say forms the basis to the way you're thinking about the world? Why don't we meet together once a week, and we'll actually read about some of this stuff, and then we'll have some of these deep conversations about it. And so he ended up meeting with all kinds of friends, including CEOs of some of the pretty large companies, for an hour every day, just one-on-one. And they would just literally read through a chapter of the John's Gospel and then talk about it. And it went so well that they produced a little resource called Word One-to-One. So look, if you are in here and you're thinking, you know what, I really would like to try and think through some of these things and try and figure out what on earth's going on and what this is all about, and you want to go deeper and you want a practical next step, do something like that. This guy may be able to put you in touch with someone. And by the way, if you came here for dinner and you had to pay and you didn't like tonight, then my friend Craig is going to reimburse you his money. I'm feeling so generous with Craig's money at the moment.
Followed by an appeal. Followed by a mid-year appeal, yes. Okay, here's another question for you. As a banker, how would you find a balance between being loyal towards your shareholders versus acting with complete honesty towards your customers? Now, remember the background we've got here in Australia.
Well, look, so there's something which is revealed in the question, which is very interesting, isn't it? Look, should I hide something if I think it's in the long-term interest of the value of the company? Now, I'll give you 2 things. One of them really isn't an answer at all, but it is something that should make you think. If they're right about what they're saying about where computing's going and supercomputing and the dawn of AI, in 5 years' time, every email that's ever been sent, every communication you've ever had, no matter how it's been encrypted, will be publicly searchable and readable. 100% of it. It's one of the biggest security things that people are now talking about at the highest level to think, what on earth do we do, given the capacity for that? So the question's interesting because built in with the question is this idea of, well, surely if we can hide something over and we think it's good, then that's in the long-term interest of the company. And the answer is, look, you can get away with it for a while. I mean, Volkswagen did very well with their thing for a while. There were all kinds of banking groups that got away with it for a while. When Barings Bank collapsed, any of you remember that? It got sold for £1. I was going to buy it myself, but they didn't have change for a £10 note. So, I was like, forget it. When Nick Leeson, who was the guy who brought down that particular institution, was arrested in Germany, there was a great picture in the Financial Times the next day, because Nikon took out a full paid ad of him being arrested. And I know this because I am so terribly short-sighted. If I take off my glasses, I'm literally blind. And Nikon, at that time, made the strongest glass that you could have. That makes sense for really bad short-sightedness. And it had a slight green tinge to it. So if you took a picture of the lenses at a certain angle, they would always flash green. And when Nick Leeson was arrested in Germany, a photographer took a photograph of him, and you could see that the lenses were slightly green. And so Nikon published that photograph, put one of their telephoto lenses underneath and said Nikon, for people who like to take long shots. And basically, what I'm saying is that attitude says you're trying to take a long shot on whether you think that integrity is only important. But integrity is what you're doing when people aren't actually looking. Now, a lot of things are going to come out in the next 5 years that are going to cause a lot of unrest. A few weeks ago, I was talking in a banking context, and some of you will understand how this works. Banks have a value, they have like a capital value. The other way to calculate their influence is how much money they have under management or sort of control of. And in this particular setting, you're looking at individuals' control of about approximately 30 trillion US dollars. Now that's a sizable proportion of the global economy. When I asked them how hopeful they were for the future, their answer was 0. They said things are going to start coming out because we can't hide them any longer, and people are going to get so angry, the world is going to go into such turmoil, we can easily envision a situation in which billions of people die within the next decade or so because we'll all be at each other's throats. It was hardly an exciting conversation. So my encouragement to you is, look, it is in the best long-term value of your company to find a way to deal with this directly. Now look, honesty, we sometimes think, look, honesty isn't having someone who's just a pain, does that make sense, causing trouble. You can actually try to do that. We have to find a way to actually help people understand it is in the long-term value of the company, and it's the only thing that's going to keep you long-term secure. Now, we're so used to sometimes burying little mistakes and getting away with it that we actually think we're doing something, but it's going to come to light, if not in this one, I certainly believe in the next. And secondly, at least if you catch the failure yourself, you have a different narrative. The narrative should be, look, this is what went wrong, we've caught it, this is what we're doing to put it right. I do have a problem with the way that the press therefore deal with some of these things when they are properly caught by companies. Does that make sense? Because we should applaud that. Look, if you have lots of people working for you, the chance that nobody's doing anything wrong right now is 0. So if you want to go around pretending you're perfect, and this is the problem, we're trying to pretend that we're perfect. That is not the model to use. I'm much more comfortable with a model that says, look, every human heart is messed up. In effect, we're all fallen, all of us. Sometimes we're going to make mistakes out of judgment, and sometimes we're going to make mistakes out of character. We need to find a way, does that make sense, to think, how do we deal with those appropriately? What is the redemptive process? And we can't go around trying to simply destroy people. That makes sense? We have to find a way in which, when they have failed, we can work on the redemptive process with them. Otherwise, there's no hope. Does that make sense? You're just going to bury it. So we have to try and change that narrative. So I think it means that we have to think through our corporate culture. And it has shifted massively. In the 1980s, I mean, banking and accountancy is the thing I know most comfortable with. Without a shadow of doubt, there were accounts that were offered to some of the world's major banks and accountancy firms in the 80s where they said, we can't touch this money. You know, why are we even talking about it? Those conversations are few and far between now. Does that make sense? The sense is we can't afford to say no. And we're going to have to try and deal with that in a more systematic way. I am fearful that there's a part of what they say is true. Does that make sense? That we're potentially storing up so much trouble for us in the future. In the sense that the public awareness of it will lead to such increasing public anger that we hit a tipping point of no immediate return. That makes sense? And we're just at each other's throats. I sincerely hope and pray that they're wrong. I'm fairly optimistic about these things. If it is possible for things to be turned around no matter how bad, then there's still the basis for hope. But we can't go around, we have to be bold enough to rephrase the question. Does that make sense? Undoubtedly, the more trust we have as a company, the better that is for our long-term value, even if there's a short-term pain. But to make sense, so we have to find a way to deal with that. I could get political at this point, but there is one other huge problem which we have, which is there is so much grey money in our economy at the moment. It's making it difficult. So the other challenge we have that we haven't talked about here, but I'll just flash it up very, very briefly, is you can make an economy so corrupt. When you talk of corruption, you mean deviance from the norm. What do you do if the norm is deviance? Does that make sense? What do you do if it's so bad, you're there? So when I was in India a little while ago, this was their number one question. And the answer is, well, at this point, you also have to appeal to government. Because you need to say to the government, look, this isn't even in your interest to do this. It may be in a government official's interest to do this, but it's not in the interest of the government. Corruption adds cost, it decreases competition, it makes everything unwork, the company has to recover that cost anyway. Does that make sense? They're normally then trying to save it at the taxation end too, so your own revenue is going to be lower. I mean, look, the overall impact of corruption is huge, and when corruption takes over economy, you make honest business impossible. So you can actually make the economy go so far that you can no longer legitimately enter anymore. And that's massively problematic. And we're going to have to be big enough to deal with that. Now, these things then start to get much more nuanced, and I'm dealing with them in a slightly flat way, which makes me a little bit nervous. But I've had the privilege of being in positions where I've seen people who are doing very terrible things stop doing them and move from wanting to kill other people to laying down their lives to serve other people. And it's always happened when they've encountered the person of Christ and had their heart changed and transformed. Well, he can do that at an individual level, he can do that at a national level. That there is actually always a long-term hope. So let's be realistic about the nature of the problem, but let's not lose hope in the process. I actually believe it is possible, but we need more and more advocates out there saying, look, things just need to look radically different to how they are now.
Okay. So thank you for coming tonight.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you very much for...
Now, there is one more thing. Yeah. There's one more thing we need to find out. Look, there were a number of questions tonight. I couldn't get through them, honestly, all of them. Some of them were quite witty. Why
didn't you ask those ones?
Well, I just wanted to cover the most important ones. So what I'll suggest is Mike will be here until 9:30, then I'm going to whisk him away to have his beauty sleep before he gets up at the crack of before dawn. So you'll have your chance to have a bit of him, but treat him like the dessert platter. Just share him around with the others on your table. Just if you've had a bit of a conversation, be aware of other people around you and move on so other people can talk to him as well. But he'll be sitting over here. Come up and say hi. If your question wasn't answered, talk to him. Now, were you lying to us or were you telling us the truth?
Oh, boy. Sadly, I was telling you the truth. In my defense, I would like to say that I got the car stuck in the water, but it wasn't sinking at that point. For any mechanically...
Somebody else did that.
For any mechanically minded people here, that's when I learned what a differential was. And why having a locking differential could be a good idea, because the free wheel was in the water and 3 wheels were on a rock. So I was safe at that point. It was when the guy came and hooked up the rope, and I looked over my shoulder and I thought, wait a minute, he's over there, the rope goes like this to our car. When he starts driving that way, we're going that way, not the way we need to go. That is literally when the whole car got dragged off the rock, hit the water, and suddenly it started coming in, and literally my father came up to the top of the hill. Picture. And I can remember looking up, just seeing him, thinking, so I got into a little bit of trouble.
Did you point at the farmer?
I did actually try. This excuse somehow didn't cut as much weight with my father as I felt it really deserved about the guy with the rope. Thankfully, he was gracious enough eventually to find a way to forgive me for it. It was a while before he lent me his car again. But that's what we were talking about. You have to rebuild trust once it's been betrayed. But anyway, yeah, so sadly, true story.
Okay, all right. So Michael didn't lie to us. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Okay.